We are living in an age of lies, and Israel is being hit with an avalanche of lies in the media, world governments, International Court of Justice, the World Court. We're being accused of genocide when we're being attacked from 7 different sides militarily, and of course attacked in so many other ways, politically, legally, in terms of the media. There is just a lack of truth in our media today. And so how are Christians supposed to understand what is happening in Israel and what it means, and not just in Israel, but throughout the broader Arab and Muslim world? That's what we're going to talk about, because part of the Joshua Fund's mission is to educate. Yes, to strengthen the church and the local churches in Israel and the neighboring countries. Yes, to care for the poor and needy with unconditional love, regardless of what they believe, that we would love them, that we would care for them. But educating Christians is a big part of what we do. It doesn't have to be just Christians, but our main focus is to educate the church around the world to understand, why does God love Israel? Because he does. And not all the church understands that. You'd like to think after 2,000 years they do, but not everybody does. And why? Biblically, why does God love Israel? Why does he say through the prophet Jeremiah, I have loved you with an everlasting love? What a moving sense that is. And then he follows it by saying, therefore I have drawn you with loving kindness. Why does God call Israel the apple of his eye? Right? That's the pupil. That's the dead center of your eye. That's how you see the world. Well, that's how God sees the world, through the lenses of Israel. It doesn't mean he agrees with every decision we as Israelis are making at any given moment, but he loves us, and he will always love us, even when we are sheep that, wander a bit over the centuries. We read that in the scriptures. But one of the most important elements biblically of the life of a believer is to educate our children, educate each other. And in the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel's writings, in chapter 33 of Ezekiel, we read these words. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the sons of your people, and say to them, if I bring a sword upon a land, and the people of the land take one man from among them, and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming upon the land, and blows on the trumpet, and warns the people, then he who hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, and a sword comes and takes him away, his blood will be on his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet, but he did not take warning. His blood will be on blood will be on himself. But had he taken warning, he would have delivered his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and a sword comes and takes a person from them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood I will require from the watchman's hand. Now, as for you, son of man, this is the Lord speaking, of course, I have appointed you a watchman for the house of Israel. So you will hear a message from my mouth and give them warning from me. October 7th was the greatest intelligence failure in the modern history of Israel since 50 years earlier to the day. The Yom Kippur War that broke out in 1973 when Egypt and Syria attacked from all directions. It's astonishing that Israel in this modern era, as strong as we are, completely missed this. My role tonight is not to talk about the intelligence failure, but I would say that one of the roles of the Joshua Fund and other Christian organizations is to not only teach the Bible from Genesis through Revelation, helping people understand, helping the church understand for sure, and anyone else who wants to listen, Jews, Muslims, anyone else, what does the Bible say about God's love for Israel and the Jewish people? And what does he say about the neighbors, right? Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors. So some people say, well, these people are not our neighbors, they're our enemies. So Jesus said, well, love your enemies. Well, come on, Lord. That covers basically everybody. You're either a neighbor or an enemy, or you're us. Right. How do you do that? Well, you can't do that except in the power of the Holy Spirit. But even in the power of the Holy Spirit, it's important to notice Jesus didn't say, well, these enemies they're not really enemies. They're just people that are misunderstood. No, Jesus allows us to understand this is evil, these are enemies. The question is, how do you respond? And I'll just give you one example. Israel is not claiming to be a nation that's following Jesus, right? We don't, there are those of us who believe in Yeshua, HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, but Israel's not a nation that's claiming to be that, right? But it does have Old Testament, biblical, Hebrew scriptures that tell us how to love your neighbor. And one of those ways is, if you're going to have to go invade your neighbor because they've invaded you, let the civilian innocents know you're coming and get out of the way. What other military in history has provided that level of awareness, information that people need to get out of the way? That's just one example. Or allowing for the entire world to provide humanitarian relief to your enemy in a war. It used to be, in biblical times and throughout history, you would starve your enemy. That's not what Israel's doing. Well, part of the educational mission is not just to teach the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, but also to help be a watchman on the wall, to help people understand what is happening and what are the trend lines, what's coming, and how do we understand these things, and how do we respond as people who love God and love His word and are called to obey. That's a big part of what the Joshua Fund does. Since October 7th, as I mentioned, Israel has faced an avalanche of lies. Just within days of the invasion, I was invited to cover Israeli President Isaac Herzog's first press conference to international media, and I was stunned, as he was, but I was stunned to see a CNN reporter accuse the president of Israel of genocide on, what was that, like day 9? More Jews have been murdered on October 7th than on any other day since the Holocaust. And now the CNN is sitting 6 feet away from the president of Israel and accusing him and our entire country of genocide. I've covered media bias for a long time. We've started 2 news agencies, All Israel News, All Arab News. We'll talk about that in a moment. The Joshua Fund, our podcast, all these other ways to help Christians understand what's really true and what does it mean? Why does it matter? How do we respond? But to actually watch a reporter accuse the president of a country that has been invaded by people who, in their actual legal charter, 1988 Hamas charter, commits themselves to committing genocide and wiping all Jews out and destroying the nation of Israel. To watch that in real time, in person, is stunning. And I wrote that article. But then we had so many other things. One of the things I've enjoyed about the former Prime Minister Bennett is that he's gone out and onto a lot of networks, BBC, Sky News, others, and his common refrain, Donald Trump has, used to have his, "You're fired," but his is, "Shame on you." Like, people would just say stuff to him, and you'd be like, you'd watch him trying to process, what in the world are you talking about? What planet are you living on? But he doesn't say it that way. Sometimes he takes it for a while and he responds, and then he says, "Shame on you," and then it's been fun to watch because you want to see somebody defending his country. But I was telling him as we met just a little bit prior to this to dinner tonight, welcoming him, Lynn and I, and some of our team. I said, we at the Joshua Fund and All Israel News, All Arab News, we subscribe to the George Costanza approach towards education. If you're a Seinfeld watcher, you know that George realized once that his entire life was a failure because every decision he'd ever made in his life was wrong. So Jerry said, well, if every decision you made is wrong, wouldn't the opposite have to be right? And George, he's like, I think that's right, that's true. And so throughout the show, he tries to do the opposite of his instincts. And it actually works out well, mostly, for George and that. So when we built our team and we train and educate our own team, we say, whatever you hate about the mainstream media or the educational system at Columbia, Harvard, wherever, do the opposite. And that's what we've been doing. We've been covering some of the craziest attacks on Israel, including the fact that the New York Times, the Associated Press, Reuters, and CNN actually had hired on their payroll Hamas terrorists that they called photojournalists, but actually were implicated in being involved in the Hamas invasion of October 7th. That's what we're up against. People who don't even say sorry. People who don't seem to care that they've hired terrorists. Now, within the Joshua Fund, education has been part of our mission since 2006 when we started. But just a few years ago, we launched a podcast because we find that many Christians don't want just a snippet of information. They want to hear a conversation. They want a long-form discussion. It could be a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, with me, with Lynn, with Israelis, with Palestinians, geopolitical experts, pastors, ministry leaders, giving perspectives on whatever is the news of the day or issues that we think are important that is hard to unpack in a newsletter article as important as those are. And so podcasting was a way we thought, all right, this is a way to help people hear it more, and as they're driving and as they're doing the dishes and whatever, they can absorb that information. We were shocked that in the first few years, the Inside the Epicenter podcast soared to be in the top 5% of all podcasts worldwide. And in the last year, since October 7th, Inside the Epicenter has soared into the top 1.5% of all podcasts in the world by God's mercies and grace. And since we began, more than 14 million downloads and views. We also have it on YouTube, so that's a way a lot of younger people, maybe not just young people, I'm just saying we're also trying to help educate young people, and YouTube is a great place to do that. Now, a few years ago, 4 years ago, we launched a corollary to the Joshua Fund. These two media organizations called All Israel News and All Arab News. Later, not right this second, I want you to go to allisrael.com, and you can actually sign up for a free newsletter so that every day you get an email with all the top headlines. And you'll find that the headlines are as current as just about an hour and a half ago when I wrote the most recent one. And how crazy it is that we're on the verge of a major invasion, Israel is, into southern Lebanon, and the President of the United States is demanding a 21-day ceasefire. And yet in the statement that he put out with our America's Arab allies and European allies, the word Hezbollah was not mentioned. So who are we ceasing fire with? These are people that fired 10,000 missiles at us. Who are we ceasing fire with, and why? What are we getting out of that? Well, you'll see, as you see on the screen, there's a surge of traffic. We were happy in those low days when we had actually reached 1 million views a month on All Israel or All Arab News combined, but I don't want to say it's exploded. That's not appropriate, but it has surged. The traffic, and we were averaging between 5 and 6 million views. Now, is that enough? No. But in month 1, several years ago, of CNN Plus, their new digital strategy, they invested $300 million, and we had as much traffic as they did. And then they went bankrupt. Think of what we could have done with 1% of that. We're working on much less than 1% of that. But we're seeing growth. We're seeing impact. Now, the growing impact of All Israel News is that if you're going to be a group of Christian journalists living in Israel, who, as Israelis, as well as we have Arabs and Americans and others working with us, you've got to be able to establish enough credibility, right? I told the team, don't think about, your job is not to think about traffic. Your job is to think credibility, credibility, credibility. And with credibility, we believe people will come and they will trust us. And that's what we're watching happen. But we need to be able to sit down with the newsmakers of Israel and hear from them and their inner circles, understand how they see the world. We may or may not agree, right? But we've got to be able to cover them fairly, in a balanced way. We need to have access to them. And so over the last several years, I've had this opportunity with my colleagues to sit down with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and cover him, Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Somebody that you may have heard of, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. You'll learn a little bit more about him today. He invited me to his home to spend an hour interviewing him for All Israel News and for the Rosenberg Report. Former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, opposition leader Yair Lapid. We have access because we are establishing ourselves as the mainstream media. We're providing the very coverage that they should, but don't. We've covered, by God's grace, we've had opportunities to sit with hostage families and interview them and talk to them and share their stories, survivors from October 7th. We've interviewed and covered believers, Christians, Messianic Jews in Israel on the front lines. Tomorrow you're going to hear from the pastor of the only evangelical congregation in Sderot, the largest Israeli town right on the southern border of Gaza, where Hamas terrorists walked under his window on the morning of October 7th as they were murdering so many. And so being able to sit with them, cover their perspective. But not just Israelis. We have been covering the Christians in Gaza. Now, I've been in Gaza. I got to go into Gaza, which I'll mention in a moment, but we haven't been able to get to the two churches where most of the Christians in Gaza, evangelical Christians, are holding up. Not just evangelicals, but Roman Catholics and Orthodox as well. We are covering them. In fact, we're covering them more, and I don't want to say better, but we're providing more direct coverage of them than any other news site that I'm aware of. That's actually a sad distinction, but most people just aren't trying to cover what's happening with Palestinian Christians in Gaza. We're having the opportunity to do that because we lean into it and we try to find good sources and report the truth. We've been covering evangelical leaders who have been coming in regular numbers to Israel. I had the opportunity to invite, as part of the Joshua Fund, All Israel News, we put together a delegation of Governor Mike Huckabee and other evangelical leaders to come and sit with hostage families and pray for them, and go and visit the border communities where that have been so devastated, blood-soaked floors of homes that are scorched black by the Hamas fires that set whole families on fire and burn them alive in their homes. All the walls are pockmarked with bullet holes. While we were there, the fight was so intense, Israeli artillery was heard booming right over our heads. To be able to bring evangelicals to see that and experience that and go back as witnesses is important to us. And also then to encourage evangelical leaders in the United States to watch the 47-minute Hamas atrocities film that the IDF compiled. It's confidential. It's an invitation-only moment. But Prime Minister Netanyahu asked me, could you help more evangelical leaders, pastors and leaders, at least see this so they can explain? We can't just show it to everybody. It's too sickening. Joel, would you help? And we did. And including one of the showings was at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, I had the opportunity with the IDF to be invited to go into Gaza in February. It's rare that Christian media gets invited to go into a war zone like that, but we did that. And it was really an extraordinary, sobering day for me to wake up in Jerusalem, kiss Lynn goodbye, drive an hour and a half to the border, put on a flak jacket and a helmet, get in an armored personnel carrier with my photographer, and go in the hour and 15 minutes to Khan Yunis, the biggest city at that time that was the biggest fight going on with Hamas at that time, and then go down into terror tunnels that had never been seen by reporters before. There were several other media with us, but to actually go into a cage where 12 Israeli hostages had been held just days before Israeli forces arrived. And for me, as a believer, to pray in that cage, as some of the other reporters went to go see the lair of Yahya Sinwar and the other senior Hamas leaders that had run the war against Israel from the quarters right next door to the cage. To do that, to pray for the hostages and their families in one of those cages. And then when we came out, my CBN News colleague, I work with All Israel News, of course, and TBN, Trinity Broadcasting News, which is the most watched Christian television network in the United States, which after they saw what the Joshua Fund and All Israel News were doing, said, that should be a TV show. That should be a weekly primetime show, and that's what we do. But I was with my CBN News colleague, and he said, do you want to take communion? This is just before we get in the armored personnel carrier to leave. And you can hear machine gun fire all around. It's a surreal situation for me. I've been to Afghanistan and Iraq, but not anything like this. And he says, you want to take communion? I said, communion? Seriously? And he goes, it's like he opened up his coat like it was a secret, and he had communion wafers and grape juice, and we bowed our heads, and we prayed that God, the God of Israel, would break the satanic stronghold of Hamas that is terrorizing the people of Gaza, that the people of Gaza would be liberated, and that the people of Israel would be liberated from this terror as well. To be able to pray that way in the name of Jesus in Gaza is just an amazing opportunity that God opened that door. Yes, through the IDF international spokesman, which I appreciate, but that requires credibility, and that's what we're doing. In a moment, we're going to hear from the Prime Minister as he gives a keynote address, and then we're going to take some time of Q&A. But I just wanted to give you that brief opener, that it's not enough, in our view, just to care for the poor and needy in a time of war. It's not enough just to strengthen local believers and refresh and encourage the pastors. We're going to cover all of that over the next few days. But there is a war against the truth. There is an avalanche of lies. It's an age of lies. And if Christians won't stand up and speak the truth, yes, about the Bible, of course, but about our brothers and sisters, Israelis and Palestinians, about whom the world is lying without hesitation. We need to tell the truth in an age of lies, especially in an age of lies, and that requires courage. David told the truth when the entire Israeli army was paralyzed because there was a giant that was cursing the God of Israel and the people of Israel. And David was brave. He had courage that maybe his brothers and the rest of the Israeli army at that time did not have. Even the king of Israel did not have. David knew his God. He knew the scriptures. And he knew that this giant would not survive, would not prevail against the God of Israel and the people of Israel. And he took action based on that. And I would say that many of us, we all know we are up against media giants. They are better funded. They are huge. These are titans of the age. But they are telling lies against the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, our God, and against his people. And we need the courage to say, okay, we're not as well funded, and we don't have the armies, we're not a giant, but we have the courage to believe in what God has taught us through his word and to stand on that. And I'm grateful that the Joshua Fund and All Israel News, All Arab News takes that